My name is Victoria Hale, and I am 32 years old, and on a Friday evening in October, I stood in the ballroom of the Riverside Hotel in downtown Chicago at a tech industry awards ceremony, watching my mother tell a woman at her table that I was between jobs right now and had been struggling to find my footing, and the woman made a sympathetic face and said, "Oh, that's so hard for young people these days." And my mother nodded with practiced concern and said, "We just keep encouraging her to stay positive," and I was standing 15 feet away, wearing a black gown, holding a glass of champagne, waiting for my name to be called as one of the evening's award recipients, and I had specifically invited my mother to this event after. She spent the last 2 years telling everyone in her social circle that I was unemployed, and I wanted her to be in the room when the executive director of the Chicago Technology Council walked to the microphone and said, "Our next honoree is the founder and CEO of Catalyst Digital Solutions, a company that has grown to 43 employees and $7.2 million in annual revenue in just under 4 years. Please welcome Victoria Hale." And I watched my mother's face go from polite attention to frozen confusion to something that looked like she'd been struck. And I walked past her table on my way to the stage, and I didn't look at her because I wanted her to sit in that moment alone. Let me rewind, because you need to understand how a mother convinces herself that her daughter is failing while that daughter is quietly building an empire. And the answer is simple. She never asked, and I stopped telling her because I got tired of being translated into something smaller every time I shared good news. I grew up in a suburb outside of Detroit with my parents, Richard and Carolyn, and my younger brother, Ethan, who was 2 years younger, and the kind of kid who could get a B- and be praised for trying hard, while I could get an A and be asked why it wasn't an A+, and that dynamic never changed, it just got more sophisticated as we got older. I was good at math and science, and I liked solving problems, and I went to the University of Michigan and studied computer science, and I graduated with honors and got a job at a software company in Chicago, making $61,000 a year. And my mother told her friends I was doing something with computers, and when they asked for details, she'd say, "Oh, I don't really understand all that technical stuff, but she's working," which was true. But the way she said working made it sound like I was barely holding on. I spent 3 years at that company, and I learned how businesses use software and where the gaps were, and I saw very clearly that small and mid-sized companies were paying for enterprise-level platforms they didn't need, or they were patching together cheap tools that didn't talk to each other. And I started thinking about building something in between something affordable and integrated and specific to companies with 20 to 200 employees, and I spent nights and weekends sketching out what that would look like. When I was 27, I told my parents I was leaving my job to start my own company, and my father said, "Doing what?" And I said, "Building software for mid-market businesses." And my mother said, "Is that stable?" And I said, "No, Mom, it's a startup. It's the opposite of stable, but I think I can make it work." And she said, "Well, I hope you have a backup plan." And I said, "I don't." And my brother Ethan, who was working a sales job, he hated, said, "At least I have job security." And my mother nodded like that was the smarter choice. I started Catalyst Digital Solutions in my apartment with $12,000 I had saved and a developer I hired on a contract basis named Priya, who believed in what I was building. And we worked 16-hour days for 8 months, and we built the first version of the platform, and I reached out to every small business owner I had ever met, and I offered them a free trial, and 10 of them said yes, and 6 of them stayed on as paying customers after the trial ended, and that was enough to keep going. My mother asked me once during that first year how the little project was going, and I said, "It's not a project, Mom, it's a company." And she said, "Okay, how's the company going?" And I said, "We have 6 clients and we're building more features." And she said, "That's nice." And then she asked if I was dating anyone, and I stopped talking about work after that, because I realized she had already decided what my life looked like, and nothing I said was going to change the picture in her head. By the end of year 2, we had 38 clients, and I hired 2 more developers and a part-time customer success person, and I moved the operation out of my apartment and into a small office space in a co-working building, and we hit $1.3 million in revenue, and I took a salary for the first time, $52,000, which was less than I made at my corporate job, but I owned equity in something I was building, and that mattered more than the paycheck, and I didn't tell my mother any of this because she had started telling people I was trying to get a business off the ground in a tone that suggested it was a phase I'd grow out of. Year 3 was the year everything accelerated. We landed a client with 180 employees, and they needed a custom integration, and we built it, and it worked so well that they referred us to 3 other companies in their network, and suddenly we were adding 10 new clients a quarter, and I had to hire faster than I was comfortable with. And I brought on a COO named Marcus who had experience scaling teams. And he looked at our numbers and said, "Victoria, you're sitting on something. That could be worth 50 million in 5 years if you do this right." And I said, "What does doing it right look like?" And he said, "Stop underpricing your product and start acting like the CEO you are." And I listened. I raised our prices by 30% and we didn't lose a single client, and we closed Q3 of that year at 4.1 million in revenue, and I had 17 employees, and I was paying myself $98,000 a year. And my mother called me one afternoon and said she ran into my old roommate from college at the grocery store, and the roommate mentioned she'd seen my company website, and my mother said she didn't know I had a website, and I said, "Mom, I've had a website for 3 years." And she said, "Well, you never sent me the link." And I said, "I've mentioned it at least 5 times. And she said, "I don't remember that." And then she said, "Your brother got a promotion." And I said, "That's great, Mom." And she spent the next 20 minutes talking about Ethan's new title and his raise, and I sat there listening, and I thought about the fact that I was running a multi-million-dollar company, and my mother had just spent half an hour talking about my brother's middle management job like it was a Nobel Prize. The breaking point came at a family dinner 6 months before the award ceremony. My parents had hosted a barbecue and invited extended family, and my Aunt Linda asked me what I was up to, and before I could answer, my mother said, "Oh, Victoria is still working on her startup," and Linda said, "How's that going?" And my mother said, "It's hard to make those things profitable, but she's trying." And I said, "Actually, Mom, we're projected to hit 7 million this year." And my mother laughed a light dismissive laugh and said, "Victoria, don't exaggerate." And I said, "I'm not exaggerating." And she said, "Honey, you don't need to make it sound bigger than it is." And I looked at her for a long moment and I said, "Okay." Mom and I walked inside and I didn't come back out, and I decided right then that I was done trying to correct her. If she wanted to believe I was struggling, I'd let her believe it until reality hit her in the face so hard she couldn't pretend anymore. 3 months later, I got an email from the Chicago Technology Council saying I had been nominated for their Emerging Founder Award, and they wanted to know if I'd be available to attend the ceremony in October. And I said yes, and I bought 2 tickets, one for me and one for my mother. And I called her and said, "Mom, I have an event in October and I'd love for you to come." And she said, "What kind of event?" And I said, "It's a professional thing, a dinner." And she said, "Is it formal?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, I suppose I can come." And I said, "Great, I'll send you the details." And she said, "Will there be people there I should know about?" And I said, "Probably." And I left it at that. The night of the event, my mother showed up in a navy dress and pearls, and she looked around the ballroom at the banners and the stage setup and the tables with corporate sponsor logos, and she said, "This is fancier than I expected." And I said, "It's an industry event, Mom." And she said, "What industry?" And I said, "Tech." And she said, "Oh," and she didn't ask anything else. And we sat down at a table near the front, and my mother immediately started chatting with the woman next to her, and I heard her say, "My daughter invited me. I'm not sure exactly what this is all about." And the woman said, "Are you here for one of the honorees?" And my mother said, "Oh no, I don't think so." And I sipped my champagne and I waited. The program started and the executive director gave opening remarks, and then they started presenting awards, and my mother was half paying attention, scrolling on her phone under the table. And then the director said, "Our next category is Emerging Founder of the Year." And my mother looked up and the director said, "This award recognizes an individual who has demonstrated exceptional leadership in building a high-growth technology company, and this year's recipient launched her business 4 years ago and has scaled it to over 7 million in annual revenue with a team of 43 and has been recognized for her innovative approach to mid-market software solutions." And my mother glanced at me and I kept my face neutral, and the director said, "Please join me in congratulating the founder and CEO of Catalyst Digital Solutions, Victoria Hale." And the room started clapping, and my mother's mouth actually fell open, and I stood up and I smoothed my dress and I walked to the stage, and I didn't look back because I wanted her to feel every second of that walk. I gave my acceptance speech. I thanked my team. I thanked Priya and Marcus by name. I thanked the clients who took a chance on us early, and I talked about building something that mattered, and I did not thank my family because they hadn't been part of it. And when I walked off stage holding a glass award with my name etched into it, my mother was standing near the table looking like she'd just watched a magic trick. She couldn't figure out, and she said, "Victoria, I didn't know." And I said, "I told you, Mom, I told you so many times." And she said, "You said you had a startup, you didn't say it was like this." And I said, "What did you think a startup was?" And she didn't have an answer, and I said, "I need to go talk to some people," and I walked away, and I spent the rest of the night networking with investors and other founders, and every time I glanced over at my mother, she was sitting at the table alone, staring at the stage. She called me the next day and said, "We need to talk," and I said, "Okay." And she said, "I feel like you deliberately hid this from me." And I laughed out loud and I said, "Mom, I have told you about my company at least a dozen times. I told you our revenue. I told you we were hiring. I told you we landed major clients, and every single time you either changed the subject or made it sound like I was exaggerating, or you just didn't listen because it didn't fit the story you wanted to tell." And she went, "Quiet." And then she said, "What story?" And I said, "The one where Ethan is the successful one and I'm the one who's still figuring it out." And she said, "That's not fair." And I said, "Maybe not, but it's true." And she said, "I've always supported you." And I said, "No, Mom, you've always doubted me, and there's a difference." She tried to recover. She started telling her friends about my award and my company, and she sent me a text saying she was proud and asked if I could send her the link to an article that had been written about the ceremony, and I sent it, and she posted it on social media with a caption that said, "So proud of my daughter," and I didn't comment. I didn't like it. I just let her have her revisionist history because I didn't need her validation anymore. I'd spent 4 years building something without it. 6 months after the ceremony, my company was acquired by a larger tech firm for $43 million, and I walked away with $18 million after taxes and investor payouts. And I didn't tell my mother the number, I just told her the company had been sold. And she said, "What does that mean for you?" And I said, "It means I'm financially secure for the rest of my life." And she said, "Oh my goodness, Victoria, that's incredible." And I said, "Yeah, it is." And she said, "We should celebrate." And I said, "Maybe," and I never did because celebration requires history, and she hadn't been part of mine. I see my parents a few times a year now, usually at holidays, and my mother introduces me as her daughter, who sold her company, and she says it with pride, like she was there the whole time. And I don't correct her in public, but I also don't pretend. We're close, and my brother Ethan asked me once if I was still mad at Mom, and I said, "I'm not mad. I'm just done expecting her to see me clearly." And he said, "She's trying," and I said, "She's performing," and those aren't the same thing. If you have ever built something significant, while the people closest to you were telling everyone you were barely getting by, if you have ever been underestimated so thoroughly that people were shocked when they saw the truth, I need you to know. Their belief in you was never required for your success, and their disbelief doesn't reduce what you built. And the moment you stop trying to convince them and start letting your work speak is the moment you realize how much energy you were wasting on an audience that was never going to clap until someone else told them to, and by then you don't need the applause anymore because you've already given yourself the standing ovation that mattered.